Hey, welcome everybody. Thank you for being able to attend our webinar about a walk on the dark side. We thank you very much for attending. We're just going to wait a couple of minutes to get everybody that's having any type of technical issue through their issues. We're working with a number of people to be able to get on. And we'll be starting the webinar shortly. Just to, kick it off while everybody's waiting. I'm proud to say and happy to say we have one of our strongest partners, Dustin Hunter from Hogan Assessments on the line. Dustin works hand in hand and is a daily resource for me over at Hogan to be able to help answer any questions that we have for our customers and our clients. Dustin works with a number of partners kind of domestically, but again, he holds a master's in educational psychology and an MBA from Oklahoma State University, where all of his research centered on graduate training effectiveness, resilience among the risk population. He was very happy to provide some ideas in terms of great discussion topics and what seems to go over really well and resonate with our clients. And I am going to welcome Dustin to the call. Dustin, hopefully you can hear me and everybody else can. And we, now that we're kind of approaching on 3 after 11, we'll go ahead and get started.
That sounds great, Jag, and thank you for that introduction.
No problem, my pleasure. And again, we are taking live questions throughout the broadcast. You'll see a few polls come up every once in a while. We'd love to be able to see your engagement on that. And again, as much as Dustin's going to be available for question and answer at the end, if it's relevant, send that over to me into the Q&A, and I'll be happy to ask Dustin on your behalf at any point during the conversation. Over to you, Dustin. Sorry.
No, thanks a lot, Jag. I appreciate that. And again, appreciate the introduction. And just for the audience to introduce myself, I think this may be my first time sharing with all of you. So again, as Jag mentioned, I'm Dustin Hunter. I manage the international distributors practice here at Hogan. I've been here for nearly a decade now and been pleased to be able to work in our indirect channel the entire time. Primarily focused on building and growing the Hogan footprint, and in our international markets. And so I was thrilled to be able to present today to you about a topic that I think is probably the most, from a Hogan standpoint, well-known or notorious, which is about helping leaders manage their dark side. So today what we'll essentially be talking about is what's the impact of leadership derailment, what's the impact on the business, and essentially what to do about it, what to look for. And what we hopefully do today is to go into a few ways that organizations can start maybe awareness, maybe from a leadership development perspective, some programs around helping leaders manage the dark side, and essentially just point you to the importance of looking at this dimension of personality. So we'll talk a little bit about where the dark side comes from, when it emerges, etc. And as Jag mentioned, we've got, just from a housekeeping perspective, please feel free to ask questions as we go along. We'll have some time at the end to answer questions as well. And I'll also be sending my slides over to D-TECK so that they can send them to you, so don't feel like you have to write everything down. But to start off the webinar today, what we thought we would do with the help of Zach is ask the audience, again, hearkening back to our central theme here of the dark side and leadership, what we thought we'd do is actually ask you in a poll, how many of you have ever worked for an incompetent or an intolerant boss? And again, as the poll says here, don't worry, we're not taking down your name, we're not taking down your former boss's name and contact details. Just from a percentage standpoint, we want to understand how many of you have worked for maybe a toxic leader, or would say that you've been in that situation in the past. So I'll give you guys a little bit of time to answer that.
Yeah, we'll give everybody another 10 seconds. We had an amazing amount of people tell us that 94% of the people that have worked or have ever worked with an incompetent or intolerant boss, and only 6% have come across with no, and maybe they're a very lucky 6%.
Well, these numbers, I think, are very much in line with the topic, I won't say encouraged to see the numbers, but I'm at least glad that they go along with our central theme. The 6% of you that haven't, maybe you could send Jag and I your details after the call, and we can swap some stories there on what your leaders are doing well. But again, the numbers here certainly reinforce that there certainly is a growing problem with leadership incompetence and manager incompetence, and that's something that we want to orient organizations to. Again, not from the standpoint that we're pointing the finger or shaming people for this, but just that it's important to pay attention to, and that it's at a point where we're talking about bottom line results, and that's what we're going to focus on specifically today. Let me go ahead and advance the slides here. So again, Hogan's central premise, our basically MO here is that we are trying to put a better framework and understanding around effective leadership. And we'll get into a bit later in the presentation actually operationally defining leadership and how there are a few different views of what makes an effective leader from an organization standpoint, from an HR standpoint, from an academic standpoint. We'll go into that in a little bit, but essentially the first point is that this isn't just an HR fad. So we know that from a self-help perspective, there are a lot of gurus out there and a lot of folks that are claiming to have the answer to successful leadership. But what we know is that it's actually pretty complicated, and that an individual's personality influences how they lead other people. And again, that's what we can add. That's the sort of the sauce that Hogan lends to the equation when it comes to understanding who you are as a leader. At Hogan, we say who you are determines how you lead. And that, again, has some really implicit consequences for business unit performance, and specifically from a financial standpoint. So what we've seen in terms of the financial consequences is that a high-performing executive can add a great deal, a great sum of money during their tenure compared to, let's say, somebody that you classify as a mediocre performer from an executive standpoint. And let's just say in the C-suite, CXOs or CEOs account for more variability in firm performance than any other objective factor. And then, some other objective factors could be stock price, it could be tenure in the market, it could be industry, it could be a lot of macroeconomic factors. But essentially, boiling it down to one controllable event, the actual individual person that's running the firm, again, we are going to say has more variability in firm performance. And wouldn't it be nice to know something about that individual before they get hired into your organization? We're focusing and talking a lot about CEOs here, but really I think at any senior level in an organization, it's crucial to pay attention to the leader's personality, because again, one bad or toxic leader can really destroy employee engagement. And what we know is that not all CEOs are high performing. And what we've got here is some examples of what that looks like. And we'll go through a few different examples in industry. But essentially, what we would find is that Paretos Law holds true here at the leadership level, just like it does everywhere else, where 20% of the people are doing 80% of the work, and vice versa. The greatest share of people aren't doing as much work as they should, and the same is true for leadership. So leadership isn't a category or a race of heroes, right? I think we have the tendency to ascribe overly beneficial terms to people that are leading the organization. And in a lot of cases, I think it's worth examining really what the contribution is in terms of actually, building effective teams and driving performance. And so, again, what we're illustrating here is just that, again, from a leadership perspective, not all leaders are created equal. In the U.S., we have research that These are with a few partners of ours from Gallup and The Economist as well, and some surveys that we've conducted. What we found is that about 2/3 of current CEOs in the U.S. will be fired or will turn over within the next 3 years. And that number right there, I think, is striking from a few different angles or a few different levels. One is that firms spend a lot of money to select in leaders in their organization. The second for me, though, is that there's a lot of opportunity there to get it right on the next round, or to get it right in terms of the next opportunity to select a CEO or a next CXO in your organization. We find that about 2/3, let's say, of U.S. managers are actively alienating their staff. And as a result of that, it's not surprising to see that almost 3/4 of the American workforce are saying that their boss is the worst aspect of their lives. If you Google search right now, "my boss is," and let the predictive text and algorithms in Google fill in the sentence for you, you will see some really shocking words that are the most popular search terms right now around the world. And again, this isn't a problem in just North America or just the U.S. or just Canada. This is a global epidemic in terms of the fact that we have a real problem with the personalities of some of these individuals that are running organizations, really running roughshod over the people that report up to them. And again, if you boiled all this down to, okay, what's the key or the critical component here? Where is this going wrong, or where's this getting off the tracks? We're really talking from a personality standpoint about the dark side of personality. Dark side characteristics that emerge in times of stress and pressure or complacency. And for individuals that work at the top of the organization, the top of the pyramid, what we know is that's a pretty stressful place to be in and day out. And so there's not a lot of opportunity sometimes, just not a lot of time and resources for those individuals to actively manage their impressions and how they treat others on a day-to-day basis. They're spread too thin. They've got a lot going on. There's a lot of stress there that comes with having the financial burden and responsibility of growing a firm. So again, a key point here on this slide, the overwhelming majority of managers are what we would call incompetent and not necessarily cut out for leading others. And we draw a pretty distinct line here at Hogan between effective managers and effective leaders. And again, what we're saying is a leader doesn't have to be somebody that's the person at the top of the food chain or at the top of the organization. A leader could be somebody in a lower tiered position that's effective in their day-to-day job, that's also built an effective team around them, and is consistently putting up the numbers when they need to. What we see a lot at Hogan and a lot of companies that we work with is that people get promoted into incompetence. So you're taking an individual that's a high performer and from a potential standpoint, not understanding if they've got the potential to lead others into battle, to lead the firm effectively, to better utilize their resources and compete against other firms that are out to get them.
Hey, Dustin, just to, sorry, interrupt you for a second.
Please.
You know, I was posting some of these stats on my LinkedIn over the last few days, and we've had a couple of questions come from the participants, and they were wondering, and I know you covered it slightly, but are these statistics, you know, representative for Canada as well?
So I won't say that specifically, you know, the numbers apply because, again, the research was conducted in the U.S. But again, as somebody who's essentially running the distribution channel for Hogan, so we've got 40 different distributors in 56 different countries, I can tell you that these stats hold true for all major markets. So that might sound like a shockingly high number. I think if we polled the audience, and maybe that would have been a great poll question as well that I didn't think of, was polling the audience to ask, what do you think the base rate of managerial incompetence is, or managerial failure? When we ask that in the U.S. and on the international stage, typically what you'll hear is the highest number the audience is typically willing to go is about 10%. So when we come in and say that the number is actually much closer to 2/3 to 3/4, we get some shocked looks. Yeah. But, from an engagement standpoint, again, we're partnering with a lot of firms that are running engagement surveys. We're working with a lot of firms from a personality perspective. We can verify that this data is true. And I think, and I'm not sure in Canada, but in the U.S. for sure, there's been a really recent resurgence in engagement surveys. In fact, a lot of companies here are using pulse surveys. So I think what went from like an annual, check of are my employees satisfied has now almost become an obsessive search. And in a lot of companies, a lot of major enterprise level companies, they're doing daily pulses or pulse checks and asking some really targeted questions around employee happiness, satisfaction, and engagement. So we're trying to move the needle from, having a disengaged workforce to really not put the problem back on them, but really say the problem actually is in the people that are leading the charge, that are leading the disengaged workforce. We would say that that's a leadership problem.
Yeah, and I would, just to kind of add a little bit more color, I've worked with organizations all over Canada and all over the U.S., and, we're not far off as Canadians or a lot different than our neighbors to the south.
Sure, and, in the context of actually looking at personality through the lens of employee engagement, and we'll do that a bit more specifically, and I apologize, I keep saying that. We'll do that a little bit later in the presentation, but we can really draw a direct link from personality to employee engagement that then extrapolates into business unit performance. And what we've got essentially now is, just in terms of what the current state of affairs is in the U.S., and just to illustrate the point about how destructive and toxic a leader can be, we've got a few different examples here from a few different industries. And again, apologies, this is U.S.-centric, but I think the examples will still be relevant for Canada, just given potentially, well, one, the proximity, and two, the fact that a lot of these companies certainly are global. Not to pick on anybody individually specifically, because any firm could be fair game, I guess. But taking example of Carly Fiorina at HP, taking really large bonuses, firing thousands of employees to cut costs. Had a merger with Compaq back in 2002 that essentially caused HP to lose half of its stock value, was eventually fired later in 2005. My other one from the tech industry is Marissa Mayer from Yahoo. A great example there was she was somebody that came in and was supposed to be a reformer, and from an efficiency standpoint was trying to make some easy wins there and took daycare benefits away from a lot of the staff. Then it came out later after she was fired as well that she had a private daycare installed in her executive office, and the firm was paying for a full-time nanny for her. So again, on the backs of the employees, she was receiving an executive level perk. And again, we're not picking on any one person or one industry or one organization here, just to reinforce the example that one particular person can come in and do a lot of damage, from a long-term perspective. Here's a great example from Merrill Lynch. This is Stan O'Neill. Tried to merge Merrill Lynch with Wachovia without board approval, subsequently was fired, and then was awarded with, a paltry $161 million severance package. So again, from a leadership perspective, from an organization perspective, there's really no consequences for these people to come in and, shake the world upside down when they're being fired and then leaving with multi-million-dollar packages. Here's another example from Home Depot. Bob Nardelli was former CEO of Chrysler. Again, during the financial crisis in 2008, was a recipient of government aid there, but as the company continued to fail, really was unable and ineffective to turn it around, was fired, took a big exit package, and it was essentially one of the largest ever for a failed executive. Again, so I think the orientation here is to say, from the food chain, from the hierarchy, the personality of these leaders really matter. And you might say, well, okay, these are, Fortune 500 level organizations, and these are individuals that were well seasoned or well tenured. But I would even say, just to beg the question of, the importance of looking at the dark side, what about a firm of 10 people? What about a startup? What about a mom and pop shop? It's still, in my opinion, just as important to get it right from a leadership perspective. The consequences can be even more severe the lower level you go, the smaller down in organizations that you go, and the more toxic it can be if one person's overlooking an entire company of, let's say, 50 or 100 people. These organizations luckily have the resources to ouster these people and pay them off and potentially recover in some cases and live to see another day. But what you don't see up here are smaller firms that just didn't have that and couldn't weather the storm when somebody came in and really turned the tables over. So again, what we're talking about is effective leadership, and to do that, we have to first operationally define what is a leader, what is effective leadership. If you look at the academic literature, if you look at what theoretically research is defining as effective leadership, it's essentially the people in charge. And we think that's a gross overestimation of what leadership is. Again, if you look at the people that make it to the top of the organizations, what we would see there is some common characteristics, essentially being very skilled in standing out, or what we would call leadership emergence behavior, being noticed, the ability to turn the attention back on you, being highly visible, being a networker, essentially being in charge depends a lot on politics. And what we're seeing here is that doesn't necessarily mean in all cases that these people have talent for leadership. Some do. Again, we're not painting a picture that none do. It's just that the vast majority don't. And again, not to pick on the former prime minister there of the UK, again, an example of a failed leader. We have our own right here in the US. We won't name names. But again, the academic study of leadership has failed, and essentially what we need to do is start examining what actually makes a great leader. And to that end, let me show you a quick video. This is only a couple-minute clip in terms of what makes a great leader.
There is no one-person model for leadership. But if you want to be successful, you better know yourself, and you better understand your teammates.
A great sales generator who hits their sales targets and above year after year isn't necessarily a good leader. They could simply be a good sales deliverer, and that's okay.
There's a very high correlation between leader personality and business results, and for years this was put up, but nobody really understood how it worked.
In hindsight, we know what made someone a good leader. We can take it apart. Taking it from the other end of the telescope is a much more difficult game.
An effective leader is somebody who leads an effective team. In fact, that's a definition of power. Power is when A gets B to do something that B would not otherwise do. That's power. What is leadership? The exercise of power.
So leadership is about getting people to pull together for a limited period of time to work together toward a common purpose. So personality drives leadership, leadership drives organizational effectiveness, and then it all comes back around to
who you are determines how you lead. And how you lead determines how groups and teams function, which determines how organizations function.
So everybody kind of devolves to investing in marketing skills, or I need to learn digital, or I need to learn more about finance or treasury or whatever else, and that's fine. But to me, the real challenge is learning about leadership, learn about yourself, how you can become better as a leader and never stop learning. It's about personality, and it's about the engagement of the leader with the follower in that relationship.
I think everybody wants from their leaders somebody to be kind and thoughtful and empathic and warm and that sort of thing. Unfortunately, the literature says that is not associated with good leadership. Why? They find it difficult to give people negative feedback, and as you Americans say, kick ass. They don't kick ass when ass needs to be kicked.
In the end, it's about whether you effectively got a group of people together to punch above their weight and to be successful.
It's one thing for us to have prototypes, stereotypes of what makes for great leadership, and see somebody who matches that stereotype or prototype. But that's very different, leader emergence, from leader effectiveness. I mean,
if being perceived as being right for the leadership role is the same as actually being right for the leadership role, why do we have so many bad leaders? Why isn't it that every selection decision of a leader, which is based on how we perceive the person, doesn't translate into somebody who's really good at it?
Okay, so hopefully the audio came through okay on that one. Did that, any questions on that one?
So we had great audio. However, we did miss the video. But we'll make sure that the video makes it out to all of the attendees in one way or another. Apologies. These things don't go as smooth as we'd like them to.
No, apologies for that. Are my slides back up on the screen now?
Yeah, your slides are back up.
Okay. We'll blame the tech people here at Hogan for that one. So apologies. And like I said, we'll send that out. But again, at least you heard the audio there. So you were just missing some talking heads in terms of, again, some really good friends of the family here at Hogan. A few of our distributors were in there as well. Dr. Hogan was also on the video. But again, we're talking about Hogan's definition of leadership. And to do that, what we would suppose is that we've got to take this back a ways from an evolutionary psychology standpoint to a concept that Hogan calls socioanalytic theory. Essentially, the premise that people evolved as group living animals, and that the survival of your tribe and the survival of your offspring really depended on warfare and being able to successfully fend off attacks from other competing tribes and to be able to secure resources for your own. And, what we evolved to be was that these, as group living animals, different members of the tribe had individual differences in terms of skills for these different things. So you had somebody that was really good at, maybe farming, and you had somebody else that was really good, from a warfare perspective. So you put those people in charge. You fast forward that to today, and essentially you've got, not to be dramatic, but you've got the same model. You've got the same setup in business. Your business is competing with the one across the street for the same resources, which would be customers. You're competing in the same market, and you're trying to put the other out of business. So again, while we're not talking about killing each other off from a literal sense like we were back then, but the behavior is very much the same. And so from a leadership perspective, we need to understand how those behaviors, again, traits that evolved to make us, again, who we are today, evolved, and understand them to see how a leader will behave, a certain type of leader will behave in a certain context. And so again, we also say that leadership should be evaluated in terms of the team's performance. So what we're saying is leadership isn't just the person that's in charge or that has the 10-year pin or the most stripes on their sleeve. We're saying leaders are essentially found at all levels in the organization and should be evaluated by the people that report to them, not by themselves. Just to compare and contrast that a bit more, from an HR perspective and a Hogan perspective, again, I see this as a concept where we're extending and expanding the conversation on leadership. Certainly, HR has a view of leadership and what makes a great leader. We're not saying that they're wrong at all. We're just saying that we can slightly reposition that and slightly reposition some of these statements to get a more effective and ultimately objective way of measuring leadership effectiveness. So again, it's taking the focus back from the individual to the team. It's essentially looking at it from a different frame or a different point of view. And so when you combine the two topics, though, leadership and personality, and again, Hogan says this, the video has this infographic that helps display this, but personality predicts leadership performance. Who you are determines how you lead. And I said that a little bit earlier today, but we very much strongly believe that. And in terms of personality, again, the contribution to leadership based on how somebody's made up is something we distinguish between bright and dark sides. So again, think of that as strengths or day-to-day characteristics and weaknesses, or what happens when you stop self-monitoring. Both of those things, both sides of that coin, are predictors of leadership performance. We won't get into in great detail today just because of time constraints. We won't necessarily be able to get into the nuanced components of bright side and dark side behavior. But again, that's something that you could pick up on a conversation with D-TECK later in terms of our different assessments and how we differentiate between the two. But essentially, managers' dark side behavior, if unchecked, certainly erodes employee engagement. We've got an infographic here, what we call the leadership value chain, and I'll just go right to it. This is something that I think perfectly illustrates the importance or answers the question of why does personality matter? Why use personality in my organizational context if we're going outside the arena of, let's say, leadership development? Well, it's because a leader's personality, and if you put in a person's name up here, a CEO, or your direct boss right now, you can see that their behavior, their value structure, their decision-making style ultimately all funnel down and impact employee engagement, individual engagement, and team level and organizational level engagement. And so getting that mix or that balance right, getting a culture match for that leader, being able to better match a leader in terms of their strengths and their watch-outs to that organization, to that team, to that industry is critical because, again, all of this essentially funnels back into business unit performance. And if you've got an entire organization of disengaged people, what's that going to mean for your sales team meeting their quotas, or for your stock price, or for customer service for people that answer the phone every day, right? Every aspect of leader's personality has an impact in some way, some measurable, observable impact on how staff, how subordinates interact. And if they're disengaged, you can bet that that's going to have some financial consequences. Here are a few different dimensions of the dark side. So these are our 11 derailers from the HDS. Again, from a time perspective, we don't have time to talk about them all today, but wanted to display them just to showcase the depth and breadth of this particular assessment. So of these derailers, we chunk these into what I'll call super factors or clusters. And essentially what that means is under stress and pressure, we have an innate response, fight or flight response, and I'm sure all of you have heard that. And we categorize and cluster these derailers essentially into those categories. So the first 5, excitable through leisurely, are what we would call our flight cluster. So under stress and pressure, your predominant response or your coping strategy is to flee or cause other people to move away or to flee from you. The next 4, bold through imaginative, or what we would call the fight response. So actively or aggressively challenging stressful situations. And then the last 2 are what we call the need to be right. So this would be under stress or pressure, basically wanting to make things right from a relationship standpoint or from a perfectionist standpoint, not wanting there to be any conflicts. So again, we've got fight, flight, need to be right. And these are universals, right? So when your back's pushed up against the wall, when you're under a timeline or a time crunch, when there's a stressful situation at work, whatever that might be, these are tendencies that emerge during those times. Again, this isn't day-to-day behavior. You're not going to see these derailers pop out all the time. Hogan would say this is unfiltered behavior. So this is you not actively monitoring what you're doing. He would also say this is you being you. So the real you are these behaviors, and to certain degrees you moderate these in different environments that you're in. For sure, and from a personality perspective, you are the same at work and at home, and probably more of who you are at home because you don't necessarily have disastrous consequences for leaving your behavior unchecked at home. In some cases, of course, you do. But that begs the question of, okay, well, if there are these dark side components, we do have these derailers, how do leaders manage them? And again, everybody shares one of those derailing characteristics. Just because you have a high risk on one of our derailers doesn't mean you're doomed or destined for failure. It's not a red mark or a target or something like that. Again, they're coping mechanisms. They're strategies that every single person has evolved since the day they were born to cope with stress. The world's a stressful place, and people seek to de-stress and to navigate and handle stress in different ways from the minute you're born. People have individual differences in how they do that and the ways that is expressed. And in some cases, what we'll focus on today is mostly from a strategic self-awareness standpoint. So by becoming yeah, go ahead, Jack.
Oh, sorry, Dustin. Again, if anybody has any questions, please feel free to send them through, and we'll ask them as soon as we can with Dustin. Dustin, I had a question come through kind of to one of your earlier slides, and one of the things that you were talking about your personality at home versus, at work. The derailers are the same, but it's about, is it more about how, through self-awareness, being able to mitigate your derailers at home versus work?
That's a really great question. So essentially the answer is yes. What we're trying to do is just from an awareness standpoint to make you aware of them, to mitigate the impact that those derailers can have on relationships. So it's a really deep question though, because I think that sort of begs the question of, okay, so through awareness and leadership development and coaching, can I coach myself out of a derailer? Will I be different from one year to the next if I really focus on that? The short answer is no. You are who you are, and that's set in your, let's say, mid-20s. People don't necessarily change over their lifetime from a personality perspective. If they do, it's only slightly. And if they do, from a major perspective, it's because of a major event, a death, a divorce, some huge tragic accident typically can cause people to reframe how they see the world. For most people, that's not the case. But for most people, just a simple awareness of the fact that when they become stressed, agitated, when they become complacent, here's what they do, is enough to at least orient them to the fact that they might be doing this unconsciously under stress to get through the situation. It's usually enough to have people slightly change or moderate their behavior in a way. What we haven't talked about yet, and I would really like to just lay this concept out there, is from a personality perspective, the differences between identity and reputation. So at Hogan, one of the value adds from our perspective is that we're looking at personality from the reputation standpoint, which is the you that we know. That's contrasted with your identity, which is the you that you know. Freud would say that that's hardly worth knowing that person anyway because you made it up. Your own self-concept and your own perception of yourself is highly favorable and particularly, I think biased to assume that everything you do is the right way. We're concerned with how other people see you, and we're concerned with the reputation that leaders develop over time. What we're trying to do is change leaders' reputations through, one, awareness, and two, behavioral change over time. We're not changing the person. We're not changing the hardwiring of their brain. We can't do that. So we're just saying that over time, repeated behavior change will lead to reputation change. But if you took a personality assessment from 1 year to the next or 5 years apart, you're still going to score the same on the assessments because, again, that part of you hasn't changed. It's like being right-handed or having a dominant hand. You can learn to write with the other hand just fine, but if I throw you a pen and say, hey, jot down my address really quickly, you'll revert to your natural instinct or to, what your brain has determined as the most efficient way to do something. The same is true with personality. So over time, what we're trying to do is repeatedly get leaders to that state where they're consistently evaluating how they're behaving under certain conditions and do it in an effective way that they're actually sustaining these changes and it's not just a flash in the pan.
Great. Hey, Dustin, thank you very much for that description. Can you just go back a slide real quick? What I wanted to get you to do is kind of explain the difference between, the two ways to manage the dark side, the idiosyncrasy credit as well as the self-awareness versus strategic self-awareness.
Sure. Well, I tell you what, let me, from an idiosyncrasy credit component, let me fast forward to this slide and I'll compare and contrast the two. Let me first say, as I mentioned a few seconds ago, all people, everybody has a derailer, right? So it's not something to be scared of. It's just something to be aware of. Too much dark side, what we say is something that will get you fired. Too little dark side will get you looked over or passed over. But being essentially back to the idiosyncrasy credit, and by the way, an idiosyncrasy credit is essentially the best way I can describe it, and this is from Hollander in the 50s, in a leadership model that he does, it's essentially earning credits from your team or from a cohort of people that you work with, earning goodwill credits for being, as this slide will tell you, having integrity, having competence, vision, or judgment in your position will earn you idiosyncrasy credits. Also, conformity with the group will earn you idiosyncrasy credits. And this says here, idiosyncrasy credits tend to offset dark side problems because then in this transactional model, leaders can cash in their idiosyncrasy credits for bad behavior based on the goodwill they've built up with their team if they're leading it, or with their team if they're perceived as the expert in the group. So we tend to overlook dark side problems for people that have built up a lot of credit. The reason I think, at least for the purposes of today, is from an awareness standpoint, I think that's the easiest place to build on actually effectively managing dark side behaviors and affecting behavioral change. But again, from a credit perspective, and this sums it up nicely, if people think you're an effective leader, they tend to forget destructive or toxic behavior. And Seymour Adler, one of the partners at Aon in the documentary clip that I showed you, talked about if being seen as an effective leader is the same as being an effective leader, why do we have so many destructive leaders? This harkens back to that point. So again, from a reputation standpoint, it's just as important to understand how other people see you. And there's a few different ways to do that. 360, I think, comes up in that component. Again, it's a great complement to personality. It's a snapshot of performance. It's a snapshot of your reputation at a given time. But to understand how to change it, you've got to look at how that person is hardwired. You've got to look at their personality to be able to change it from a long-term perspective, which is why of the two, I like to focus more on strategic self-awareness. And from a leadership development standpoint, starting with the leader's reputation and then working backwards to figure out what you need to work on. What's the most important or critical component to change based on the culture of the company, based on the team I'm working with, or the boss I'm working under? So again,
thank you, Dustin. That was great.
Fantastic. So just a couple of final thoughts here before we open it up, just generally to the audience for some questions. Just some final thoughts again to summarize. Again, dark side behavior. This is Hogan's HDS. These are the derailers we've been talking about here. Dark side behavior. This happens under stress and pressure. Destroys employee engagement and alienates team performance. We've talked about that. We showed you the performance model there about how a leader's personality can impact engagement. Bosses are poor judges of individual leadership performance. One, of their own performance because they think they're doing a great job, but two, bosses also, let's say from a 360 perspective, just to pick on that a little bit, are poor judges of subordinates' performance because they've got a vested interest in a lot of cases in making sure that people that report up to them are being rated in a certain category, mostly favorable. So they're not necessarily the people to ask about that. Again, the best people to ask about, is my leader truly effective, are asking the people that follow that leader to see if they are or not. And again, that's point 3, direct reports are the best judges. And again, we also talked about, just to wrap that up, some ways to manage dark side behavior is through awareness, which enables self-management, which to me is just, a fancy word for, again, being aware of who you are and the chances that you'll exhibit a certain derailer in a certain environment potentially could be just enough information to make you stop and say, hey, I'm going to, have a 1 minute delay on my email, on my Outlook because I'm a high excitable leader. So I know I can have a tendency to shoot missiles off the bow if I get really worked up or emotional. So I put that delay send out. If I'm a leader that likes to retreat, Maybe I've got a reminder in my office on the back of the door that says, don't close me or something like that. So it reminds me actively to be with my direct reports, not to just go off on my own or go to the golf course, right? And again, competent leadership creates idiosyncrasy credit. Again, this is just another way to help manage dark side behaviors. Okay, well, I tell you what, let's open this up for some questions directly to the audience. I know we've had a few trickle in along the way. What questions do you have on any of this? One, about effective leaders, about the dark side, about how to manage the dark side. Questions from anybody in the audience? So it looks like we had a write-in question about 360. So, and again, what I want to draw your attention to is essentially an X and a Y axis, and the importance of using both if it's an option. So a 360 would be a snapshot of performance, right? So how is an individual person or a leader doing right now as rated by themselves, other people in the organization that know them well, and their direct reports. So it's a snapshot of how you're doing at that second. It's like a movie clip, right? It's not the entire full-length feature. But the Y and the X-axis I want to draw your attention to are performance, which is a 360, and then potential, which is personality. So does a particular person have the potential to do something we need of them? Are they high potential to lead a group of people? Do they have the potential to be promoted to the next level in the organization? Do they have the potential from a succession planning standpoint to run the organization when a current leader leaves, right? So we are always asking the question from the personality or the potential side of the equation, which is potential for what? And that's what personality can help predict for you. And again, we're using the word predict here very intentionally. We can predict the likelihood at which people will succeed in a certain role based on if they've got the right personality makeup or mix to do that thing that we need them to have potential for. And again, that in the broadest terms is leadership. Do you have leadership potential or not? And we can measure that and through personality and predict that outcome through our instruments. But again, I like both. So if you've ever got the option to do potential and performance, I always say that's a really great way to reinforce, to lay a great foundation for how is this actually showing up in the organization today, as voiced by the people that are there working with you. That would be your 360. And again, personality can get into explaining why that is. So why is it that your subordinates are saying that they're upset with you? Well, they're saying you're yelling. Why are you yelling? Well, you have this specific derailer. Or why are you always, craving the spotlight and sucking up all the oxygen in the room? Well, you have this derailer, right? And so it's from a personality perspective, we can start to change how those derailers impact people over time. We're not changing you. We're not changing who you are. We're not putting you through a CRISPR machine. We're not performing brain surgery. But through behavior change and through coaching, we can really affect a reputation change there.
Dustin, sorry, I was on mute before, but by accident. I had a question come in. How do you get a manager to accept looking into himself if he thinks he's the best manager? I'm sorry, Dustin, can you hear me?
Yeah, yes. Sorry, the audio was just a little delayed there. So you were saying, how does a leader get to, I'm sorry, what now? I had to cut out.
Yeah, so it seems to be like a Dunder Mifflin kind of issue. How do you bring a manager to accept, to look into themselves if they believe that they are the best manager?
Right, okay, I see where you're going with that. That's really where I think, so what I would say there is having them take our personality assessments, having them actually go through a feedback session to show them objectively, here's how you scored on the personality assessments. And again, from a reputation standpoint, what I always say is people that scored just like you did or scored in the same patterns and trends that you had were described by other people this way. So it takes the focus off of that individual a bit. It lets them off the hook just a little bit for them to potentially extend their thinking into, oh, it's not just because I'm an ineffective leader or a bad boss or a bad manager. It's just saying that other people that scored like me were described this way. So that gives me a little leeway in terms of accepting this. And you might be asking yourself, well, how do you know other people are describing other people this way? We know that because we consistently validate the assessments through validation studies in hundreds of jobs around the world all the time. We also deploy what we call adjective checklists. So that's a situation where you would be taking the assessments and having two people that know you very well, one at work and one at home, rate a list of 400 adjectives that best describe you. And based on how you scored, we converge those adjectives into meaningful scoring patterns. So we know if you scored low or high on a scale, over thousands and millions of people were getting all constant hits on these adjectives for descriptors of people that are described in those scoring buckets. We use those in our reports. We throw out any adjectives that overlap different buckets. So if somebody is described as fun that scores low adjustment and fun that scores high adjustment, that's not a differentiated adjective. We only are concerned with adjectives that describe people that score in a certain way, and that's the information you'll see in a Hogan report.
Thank you. Just to kind of add to the last question and the answer that you've just given, in your experience at Hogan, do you come across senior leaders who are scared of assessments? If so, how do you overcome that obstacle?
So certainly, and that comes up quite a bit. I think, we do hear that a lot, and sometimes I think it's more about being self-conscious. I think is a really good word for the whole process. What I would recommend and where I've seen the most transformational change come is just in radical transparency. In a team, let's say a team development session where the leader of the team is in the same room as all the people that report up to them, they've got their personality scores up on the screen, and everybody else's are up there as well. Without full self-disclosure, you will not ever get any change, and I promise you, from a self-conscious perspective, or I'm a little hesitant to share my scores, people already know and can describe your destructive or your derailers without having you ever taken the assessment. So people already know it. This is just giving them a common taxonomy, vernacular framework for categorizing that behavior and giving them a common language to try and help move the needle on it, to help them have that conversation of, hey, Jag, you're a great leader and you really have the vision for the company, but man, you really have a tendency to fly off the handle, and it's really causing a few of us to question if we want to continue working with you. It's giving you a language by which to say, not excuse the behavior, but have a word and have a definition and have some interventions from a leadership development perspective on how to change that.
That's great. Another question just around the dark side. One of our attendees is asking, what's the discipline that can help you manage your dark side?
So I think, I think it's a lot of things. It's not just one thing, but I think if there was one particular discipline, I would just say it really underscores the need for coaching and for developing yourself. Again, it starts with awareness. Even if it's a one-time shot in the dark team development course, or if an organization's offering an assessment to understand who you are, take the opportunity. You might read something about yourself that eventually sinks in. And if it doesn't, what we say at Hogan is, ask somebody that knows you really well. Ask your spouse, ask a family member, ask a colleague at work how they would describe you. And what I think people get tripped up on a lot, back to the being self-conscious, is to be predispositioned to think that there's nothing they could be working on. The analogy I use here is professional athletes. Professional athletes go to practice every day and get coached every day. And that's essentially what separates world-class professional athletes from amateurs, is the ability to be coached, the ability to listen to feedback and improve your game. That's the X factor. If I'm a tennis player, I'm not going to think I can win the Wimbledon tournament because I've got the fastest serve in the game. If I've got the weakest backhand in the game, I won't make it past the first round. Everybody always has something they can be working on. Not one person in the assessment, in the 9 million people that have taken Hogan at this point, not one person gets a report and gets a page that says, you get a free pass on this. There's no more development work you can do. You're a perfect individual and human being. There's always development work you can do. There are always different parts about your behavior that you can better manage and that you can use to build a better and more effective team.
That's great. I've got one last question for you. And again, if anybody has any other questions, we'll once we send out the deck, please send them over to us. We're happy to answer them. I'm happy to kind of connect with everybody to go over it in depth. But one last question is how, and I'm not sure if I really completely understand the question. I'm hoping you do, Dustin. How near psychopathology are these derailers?
That's a really great question. And interestingly enough, the derailers come from some early research from a psychologist named, with the last name of Bentz, B-E-N-T-Z. He did some research and essentially used, and this was back in I believe the mid-'80s, and I forget which DSM was there at the time, let's say DSM-2. He used DSM psychopathologies to categorize destructive behaviors in a few different ways. And so what we've done is take his research and the research from Karen Horney, who was a student of Freud as well, and basically taken these from the psychopathology, taken it from the psychiatrist chair to the organization. So before Hogan, and that's the differentiator here, and again, I hope I'm not coming across as just on my soapbox, as just being passionate about this. Before Hogan, if you were talking about personality assessment, really good chance you were talking about a psychiatrist and getting a diagnosis. Hogan was the first guy to be able to demonstrate that there's a link between normal everyday behavior, a 5-factor model personality assessment, and organizational success. He then extended that into toxic or destructive leadership with the derailers a few years later, and took these same concepts that this person mentioned with the psychopathologies into essentially these derailers that people have, that again, not everybody operates the same way under stress and pressure, which is why I like to talk about them as overused strengths or coping mechanisms or strategies, because everybody has coping mechanisms. Everybody has those capabilities under stress and pressure. So we're not diagnosing people. This isn't a clinical tool, but from an organization standpoint, people do behave in these 11 similar ways when they derail.
Hey, thank you very much, Dustin. To everybody that joined, thank you for coming over, having to listen to some of the great topics that Dustin is able to present for us. We're looking to make this a monthly activity in and around the Hogan product suite. If you have any thoughts or something that you would like to have us go deeper into on one of these WebExes, please, send me an email or send one of our team members an email stating what you'd like to hear. We're happy to be able to kind of present on these items. And again, we're going to try and make this a monthly activity. One other item I wanted to make you aware of, we haven't selected the topic yet, but we have Dustin coming to us on November 4th, in which we'll have our first Hogan meetup with D-TECK in the Toronto area. So I look forward to kind of being able to tell you more about it. But again, if you have other topics, other interests that you would like to hear about, please email us, let us know, and we're happy to be able to present the topics that are most meaningful to our Hogan family. So again, thank you very much, Dustin, all of the attendees, and we will reach out to everybody with the slide deck from today.
Yeah, let me just jump in quickly and say thank you, first and foremost, everybody, for their time and attendance today. And hopefully, again, to Jack's point, see you on November the 4th.
All right, great. Thank you, everybody. Thank you, everybody. And I know we're a minute over, and we really do appreciate your time. Thank you. Bye-bye.